The moment a room full of people thanked my mother-in-law for planning my baby's first birthday party was the moment I realized I had somehow become a guest at my own celebration. I wish I could say I noticed the warning signs immediately. I wish I could say I recognized what was happening before the decorations were hung, before the cake arrived, before relatives started filling the backyard. But the truth is that when you spend months focused on making a day perfect for your child, you do not always notice someone quietly stepping into your place. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 34 years old, married to Ethan, and the mother of a little boy named Noah. On the day this story began, Noah was turning 1 year old. It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. For nearly 3 months, I had planned every detail of that birthday party. I picked the theme. I ordered the invitations. I coordinated the food. I spent evenings after Noah went to sleep making decorations by hand because I wanted everything to feel special. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about celebrating the first year of my son's life. That first year had been exhausting and beautiful all at once. Sleepless nights. First smiles. First steps while holding onto furniture. First words that sounded nothing like real words but somehow meant everything. I wanted a day that reflected all of that. The party was held in our backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. The weather was perfect. The sky was bright blue. The grass had just been cut the day before. Colorful balloons floated above picnic tables covered with cheerful tablecloths. Noah's smash cake sat safely inside the refrigerator waiting for the big moment. Everything looked exactly the way I had imagined. Ethan wrapped his arms around me that morning while we finished setting up. "You did an amazing job," he said. I smiled. "I just want Noah to have a wonderful day." Ethan laughed softly. "He is 1 year old. He is going to remember none of this." "I know," I said. "But I will." At the time that answer felt simple. Later it would feel painfully ironic. Guests began arriving shortly before noon. Friends, cousins, neighbors, aunts, uncles, grandparents. The backyard quickly filled with conversation and laughter. For a while everything felt perfect. Then Linda arrived. My mother-in-law stepped through the gate carrying several gift bags and wearing a bright smile. Nothing about her entrance seemed unusual. She hugged relatives, complimented the decorations, kissed Noah on the forehead. Exactly what any grandmother might do. I remember feeling relieved to see her in a good mood. Linda and I had never openly fought. We were not especially close, but we were polite. I believed we understood each other. Looking back now, I think that belief blinded me. Within 20 minutes of arriving, Linda somehow became the center of attention. At first it happened so subtly that I barely noticed. She greeted guests before I could reach them. She directed people toward the food table. She answered questions about the party schedule. She introduced Noah to distant relatives. None of those actions seemed inappropriate on their own. In fact, they looked helpful. That was what made it so difficult to recognize. Then something happened that left a strange feeling in my stomach. A family friend I had known for years walked up to Linda and smiled warmly. "You did such a wonderful job putting this together." Linda accepted the compliment without hesitation. "Thank you," she said. "I wanted everything to be perfect for him." I stood less than 10 feet away holding a tray of cupcakes. For a moment I thought maybe she would correct the misunderstanding. Maybe she would point toward me and explain that I had planned the entire event. She did not. Instead, she continued talking as though the compliment belonged to her. The family friend walked away. Linda moved on to another conversation. And I found myself standing there wondering why that exchange bothered me so much. At the time, I told myself I was being sensitive. But over the next hour, the same thing happened again. And again. And by the time I finally looked around the backyard with fresh eyes, I noticed something that made my heart sink. People were treating Linda like the host of the party, and somehow I was starting to disappear. The longer the party continued, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. Everywhere I looked, Linda seemed to be standing exactly where I should have been. She was the one greeting new arrivals. She was the one introducing Noah to relatives. She was the one answering questions about the decorations, the food, and the schedule. The strange part was that nobody appeared to find it unusual. To everyone else, it probably looked like an enthusiastic grandmother helping during an important family event. But I had spent months planning every detail, and somehow I felt less visible with every passing minute. I tried focusing on Noah instead. He sat happily in his high chair near the patio, waving tiny hands at anyone willing to smile back. His blonde curls bounced every time he laughed. Watching him usually grounded me. It reminded me what truly mattered. Yet even then something felt off. Several guests approached Linda before they approached me. One cousin I had not seen in nearly a year walked directly toward her. "You must be so proud," he said while looking at Noah. Linda smiled warmly. "I really am." Again she did not correct the assumption. Again she accepted a role that was not hers. I carried a tray of drinks past them and caught only part of the conversation, but it was enough to leave me unsettled. About 30 minutes later, another guest stopped beside me. "Your mother-in-law has done an incredible job today." I forced a smile. "The party?" "Yes," she replied. "Everything looks beautiful." I thanked her politely, but inside I felt confused. Why did everyone think Linda had organized the event? Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. Every time someone complimented the party, Linda responded as if she deserved part of the credit. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough to create the impression that she had been the driving force behind everything. The realization lingered in my mind as I moved between tables checking on guests. Eventually I found Ethan near the grill speaking with a few friends. "Can I ask you something?" I said quietly. He immediately noticed my expression. "What is wrong?" I glanced toward Linda, who was holding Noah while several relatives gathered around her. "Am I imagining things?" Ethan followed my gaze. "What things?" "Everyone keeps acting like your mother planned this party." Ethan looked surprised. "Really? It keeps happening." He watched the group for a few seconds. "Maybe people are just excited to see her with Noah." I wanted to believe that explanation. I truly did. Yet something inside me remained uneasy. Before I could respond, one of Ethan's aunts approached us. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "I have been trying to find Linda." Ethan smiled politely. "Why?" I wanted to ask her where she ordered the cake. The aunt laughed. "She has wonderful taste." The woman walked away before either of us could answer. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. This time he looked just as puzzled as I felt. The cake had been my idea. The bakery had been my choice. Every design detail had come from conversations I spent weeks having with the decorator. Yet somehow people were assuming Linda was responsible. As the afternoon continued, the pattern only became more obvious. During gift opening, Linda positioned herself beside Noah before I could sit down. During introductions, she spoke first. During conversations, she referred to him repeatedly as my baby, while smiling proudly at relatives. Most grandparents use phrases like that affectionately. Under normal circumstances, it would not have bothered me. But after everything else, each comment felt different. Like another small piece of a much larger picture. Then came the moment that changed the entire day. A professional photographer Ethan had hired as a surprise arrived to take family pictures. Everyone gathered near the large oak tree at the edge of the yard. The photographer began organizing people into groups. Parents first. Grandparents next. Cousins after that. It should have been simple. Instead, as people started taking their places, I watched Linda step forward and position herself directly beside Noah before anyone called her name. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, yet it was enough to make my stomach drop. Because when the photographer looked at the group, smiled, and prepared to take the picture, he made an assumption that should never have been possible. And nobody rushed to correct him. For a brief moment, the entire group stood frozen beneath the oak tree while the photographer adjusted his camera. Children shifted impatiently. Relatives smiled toward the lens. Noah sat happily on Linda's hip, completely unaware of the tension building around him. Then the photographer looked up and said something that made my heart stop. "Okay, mom and baby right in the center." He pointed toward Linda and Noah. A few people chuckled softly, assuming it was an innocent mistake. I waited for Linda to laugh and correct him. I expected her to say something simple. Something obvious. Something like, "Oh no, I am grandma." Instead, she simply smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a confused smile. A pleased smile. The kind of smile someone gives when receiving attention they enjoy. Several seconds passed. Long enough for everyone to notice. Long enough for the moment to become uncomfortable. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. Actually, Rachel is Noah's mother. The photographer immediately apologized. I am so sorry. He looked embarrassed. I just assumed. Linda laughed lightly. These things happen. The words themselves were harmless. Yet the feeling they left behind was not. Because the photographer had not made that assumption out of nowhere. He had spent nearly an hour watching the party. Watching Linda direct guests. Watching Linda answer questions. Watching Linda stay at the center of every important moment. Watching people treat her like the host. The misunderstanding was not random. It was the natural result of everything that had happened all afternoon. The photographer quickly reorganized the group. I stood beside Noah. Ethan stood on my other side. Linda moved slightly behind us. The pictures continued. Smiles returned. Conversations resumed. To everyone else, the incident probably seemed insignificant. Yet I could not stop thinking about it. The image replayed in my mind for the rest of the day. Mom and baby right in the center. The words echoed long after the photographer packed up his equipment. Later that afternoon, we gathered around the cake table. Noah wore a tiny birthday hat that lasted approximately 30 seconds before he pulled it off and threw it onto the grass. Everyone laughed. Cameras flashed. The giant blue and white cake looked exactly the way I had envisioned months earlier. This should have been my favorite memory of the day. Instead, another moment quietly attached itself to the celebration. As relatives gathered around the cake, Linda stepped forward once again. She lifted Noah from his high chair before I could reach him. Then she positioned herself directly beside the cake while guests prepared their phones for photographs. Look at Grandma and Noah, someone called out. More cameras flashed. More pictures were taken. Once again, I found myself standing slightly outside the center of the moment. Not excluded completely, just moved a little farther away than I should have been. The distinction mattered. Nobody was openly pushing me aside. Nobody was telling me I did not belong. Yet somehow the result felt the same. By the time guests started leaving that evening, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not angry. Not yet. Mostly confused. I helped gather wrapping paper and leftover food while Ethan loaded gifts into the house. Noah eventually fell asleep in my arms, worn out from a day filled with excitement and attention. Looking at his peaceful face helped calm me. For a while, I convinced myself that I was overthinking everything. Maybe Linda had simply been excited. Maybe the photographer's mistake was unfortunate but meaningless. Maybe I was letting small moments ruin an otherwise wonderful day. Then my phone buzzed. A notification appeared from social media. Someone had already uploaded photographs from the party. Curious, I opened the album. The first several pictures showed guests arriving. Then came the cake table. Then the family portraits. As I scrolled, an uncomfortable realization settled over me. In photo after photo, Linda appeared at the center of the story. Standing beside Noah. Holding Noah. Smiling beside Noah. Directing attention toward Noah. Meanwhile, I appeared only occasionally. Sometimes at the edge of the frame. Sometimes partially blocked by other people. Sometimes missing entirely. One photograph stopped me cold. It showed Linda holding Noah beneath the birthday banner, while relatives surrounded them smiling. If someone unfamiliar with our family saw that image, they might genuinely believe she was his mother. I stared at the screen for several seconds before zooming in on the photo. Then I noticed something strange in the comments underneath. A distant relative had written a message that made my stomach tighten. Because according to that comment, what happened at the party was not the first time Linda had presented herself that way. I stared at the comment for several seconds before reading it again. It had been written by a distant relative from another state who rarely attended family gatherings. Beneath the photograph of Linda holding Noah, she had typed, "She has always acted like that little boy is hers. It reminds me of how she talked about him at Christmas." My stomach tightened immediately. Christmas. That was 6 months earlier. Noah had been barely old enough to crawl. At the time, I remembered feeling slightly uncomfortable during the holiday gathering, but I had dismissed it as normal grandmother excitement. Now I was not so sure. I clicked through more photographs while the house remained quiet around me. Ethan had already gone upstairs to put Noah into his crib. The dishes from the party still sat in the kitchen waiting to be cleaned. Yet suddenly none of that felt important. My mind had become fixed on one question. Had this been happening longer than I realized? The next morning I found myself thinking about memories I had not revisited in months. At first they appeared as isolated moments. Small things, easy things to ignore. Then they slowly began connecting. When Noah was born, Linda had insisted on being one of the first people at the hospital. I remembered how excited she seemed while introducing him to visitors. At the time I thought it was sweet. Looking back, I remembered something else. Several times she referred to Noah as my little boy, while speaking with nurses. Everyone laughed, including me. Felt harmless then. Another memory surfaced. Noah's naming celebration. Ethan and I spent weeks discussing names before finally choosing one that felt perfect. Afterward, Linda repeatedly told relatives that she had always loved the name Noah and had suggested it years earlier. The reality was that she had not suggested it at all. Yet over time, the story somehow evolved until people began believing she helped choose it. I had laughed that off too. Then came Noah's first steps. We recorded the moment on video in our living room. A few days later, Linda posted about it online. Her message made it sound as though she had witnessed the milestone herself. Technically, she never claimed credit directly. Yet she always positioned herself close enough to the story that people assumed she played a central role. One memory after another began returning. Pattern was forming. Not dramatic incidents. Not explosive confrontations. Something quieter. Something far more difficult to identify. By lunchtime, I finally brought it up to Ethan. We sat at the kitchen table while Noah played nearby with plastic blocks. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Ethan looked up from his coffee. "Of course." I explained the comment I found beneath the photograph. Then I shared everything that had been running through my mind since the party. The hospital. The naming conversations. The social media posts. The birthday photographs. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments. "You know," he finally said, "there might be something to that." I stared at him. "You noticed it too?" He nodded slowly. "Not recently. A while ago." That answer surprised me. "Why did you never say anything?" Ethan sighed. "Because every time I noticed something, it seemed too small to bring up." His explanation sounded painfully familiar. That was exactly how I felt. Every individual moment appeared harmless. It was only when viewed together that they became impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller was Aunt Carol, one of Linda's older sisters. She wanted to thank me for the birthday party. We chatted casually for several minutes before she unexpectedly mentioned the photographs. "Your mother-in-law certainly enjoyed being the center of attention yesterday." The comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Aunt Carol laughed softly. "Oh honey, she has been doing that for years." My heart immediately began racing. "Doing what?" There was a brief pause. Then Aunt Carol answered with complete confidence. "Acting like Noah is as much hers as he is yours." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because for the first time since the birthday party, someone else had finally said out loud the exact thing I had been afraid to admit to myself. After my conversation with Aunt Carol ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the call disconnected. Noah napped upstairs. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Yet my mind felt louder than it had in weeks. Acting like Noah is as much hers as he is yours. The sentence replayed over and over. What unsettled me most was not the comment itself. It was how naturally Aunt Carol had said it. There had been no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. As though she was describing something obvious that everyone else had already noticed. That realization stayed with me for days. The following weekend, Ethan and I attended a small family cookout hosted by one of his cousins. It was a casual gathering. Nothing formal. Just relatives spending time together before summer ended. I almost declined the invitation. Part of me wanted distance from family events for a while. But Ethan encouraged me to go. "Maybe it will help clear your mind," he said. I agreed. Looking back, I am glad I did. About an hour into the cookout, Noah fell asleep in his stroller. Ethan was helping near the grill, leaving me free to chat with relatives I had not seen in a while. That was when Ethan's cousin Melissa approached me. We exchanged small talk for several minutes before she unexpectedly mentioned the birthday party. "The decorations were beautiful," she said. "You really outdid yourself." I smiled. "Thank you." Then Melissa frowned slightly. "Honestly, I was surprised when I learned you planned everything." My stomach tightened immediately. "What do you mean?" Melissa looked confused by my reaction. "I thought Linda organized it." There it was again. Another person. Another assumption. Another example. I asked the question as casually as possible. "Why did you think that?" Melissa shrugged. "I guess because that is how it sounded when she talked about it." I felt a chill despite the warm weather. Talked about it when? For weeks beforehand. Melissa seemed unaware of the significance of what she was saying. She kept mentioning the party every time we spoke. My heart sank. Later that afternoon, I quietly asked a few more questions. Not because I was looking for problems, because I needed to understand what people had actually heard. The answers were surprisingly consistent. Linda had discussed Noah often. She shared updates, stories, milestones, birthday plans. None of it sounded inappropriate in isolation. Yet many relatives had gradually formed the impression that she played a much larger role in raising Noah than she actually did. Nobody believed she was his mother, of course. The reality was more subtle. They viewed her as the central force behind everything, the guiding presence, the experienced adult making important decisions. Somehow my role had become secondary. When Ethan and I drove home that evening, I told him everything. He listened quietly. Then he surprised me. "There is something I should probably tell you." I turned toward him. "What?" He kept his eyes on the road. "A few months ago, my mother corrected one of my coworkers." "Corrected him about what?" Ethan sighed. "He said you were doing a great job with Noah." I frowned. "And?" Ethan hesitated. "Mom said raising a child takes a village." The statement sounded harmless. Yet something about his expression told me there was more. "That is not all she said, is it?" Ethan shook his head. "She told him she spends so much time helping that sometimes she feels like a third parent." The words landed heavily between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan said something that confirmed my growing suspicion. "I thought it was strange when she said it." He glanced toward me briefly. "Now I think it explains a lot." Over the next week, small pieces continued falling into place. A family friend mentioned how involved Linda seemed. A neighbor recalled hearing stories that made it sound as though she supervised most of Noah's routines. Another relative remembered Linda describing herself as the person who always knew what Noah needed. Individually, none of the comments seemed dramatic. Together, they painted a very clear picture. Without ever directly claiming my role, Linda had slowly positioned herself beside it. Then one evening, while organizing old emails for an unrelated project, I stumbled across something unexpected. Buried in a family message thread from nearly a year earlier was a photograph Linda had shared shortly after Noah's birth. The image itself was innocent, but the caption beneath it made my pulse quicken. Because for the first time, I found written proof that this pattern had started long before Noah's first birthday. And once I read those words, I realized the story was much bigger than I originally believed. I stared at the email for several seconds before reading the caption again. The message had been sent less than 2 weeks after Noah was born. Linda had attached a photograph of herself holding him in a rocking chair. On the surface, it looked like a proud grandmother sharing a family moment. But the words beneath the image told a different story. "Spending another day taking care of my little boy. He keeps me busy, but I would not have it any other way." My stomach tightened. At first glance, someone unfamiliar with our family might assume she was referring to Ethan. But the photograph clearly showed Noah. More importantly, the email had been sent to relatives who barely knew us. People who depended entirely on what they were told. Suddenly, dozens of previous conversations made sense. I forwarded the message to myself and continued searching through old family threads. The deeper I looked, the more examples I found. Not dramatic declarations. Not direct lies. Something much more subtle. Linda consistently described Noah's milestones as experiences she shared personally. His first tooth, his favorite foods, his sleeping habits, his routines. She spoke about them with such ownership that anyone reading her messages would naturally assume she played a central role in raising him. Yet most of those events happened while she was nowhere near our home. That evening, Ethan sat beside me as I showed him the emails. He scrolled through them slowly, occasionally shaking his head, occasionally sighing. Finally, he placed the phone on the table. I never paid attention to this. Neither did I. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Because each message seems harmless by itself. That was exactly the problem. Nothing appeared outrageous. Nothing looked obviously inappropriate. The pattern only became visible when viewed across time, like puzzle pieces scattered across years that suddenly formed a picture. Over the next few days, Ethan decided to do something neither of us had done before. He started talking openly with relatives, not accusing anyone, not creating drama, simply asking questions. What he learned surprised both of us. His aunt remembered Linda repeatedly referring to Noah as my baby. A cousin recalled hearing Linda describe herself as the person Noah always wanted when he was upset. Another relative believed Linda helped make most parenting decisions because that was the impression she had been given for over a year. The stories were remarkably consistent. Linda had slowly built an image of herself as an indispensable figure in Noah's life. Not just a grandmother. Something more central. Something closer to a parent. One evening, Ethan returned home after meeting his father for coffee. His expression immediately told me something important had happened. Dad noticed it too. I looked up from the couch. What do you mean? Ethan sat beside me. Apparently this has bothered him for a while. That was the last answer I expected. His father was one of the calmest people I knew. He rarely involved himself in family conflicts. Why did he never say anything? Ethan shrugged. The same reason nobody else did. Every individual situation seemed too small. He paused. But he admitted that Mom talks about Noah differently than most grandparents. The room fell silent. For months I had questioned my own judgment. For weeks I had wondered whether I was imagining patterns that did not exist. Now multiple people were confirming the same thing independently. The issue was real. Later that weekend, Ethan's father stopped by our house to drop off a few items. While Noah played with blocks on the living room floor, we chatted casually. Then he surprised me. You know, Rachel, there is something I should probably tell you. I immediately looked up. What is it? He hesitated for a moment. Last Thanksgiving, several relatives assumed Linda babysat Noah almost every day. My eyes widened. She does not. I know. He nodded. But that is the impression they had. I felt my pulse quicken. Another misunderstanding. Another assumption. Another example of the same narrative spreading quietly through the family. Before leaving, he added one final detail. There is a large Thanksgiving gathering coming up again this year. I nodded. The annual event was one of the biggest family reunions on the calendar. Nearly everyone attended. You might be surprised how many people have questions now. After he left, I stood by the window watching the evening sun disappear behind the trees. For the first time since Noah's birthday, I felt something shifting. The story was no longer hidden. People were beginning to compare what they had heard with what they actually saw. And something told me that when Thanksgiving finally arrived, the carefully crafted image Linda had spent years building might not survive the truth. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving felt different from any family gathering we had experienced before. On the surface, life continued normally. Noah learned new words almost every day. The weather cooled as autumn settled across our town. Ethan focused on work. I focused on our home and on keeping life as peaceful as possible. Yet beneath that routine, something had changed. People were paying attention now. Once someone notices a pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore. One evening while organizing digital photo albums, I decided to create a folder containing every image from Noah's first year. What started as a simple project quickly turned into something unexpected. As I moved photographs into chronological order, I began noticing the same thing I had seen after the birthday party. Again and again, Linda positioned herself at the center of important moments. Hospital visits, holiday celebrations, family reunions, birthday gatherings. In photo after photo, she appeared directly beside Noah while I often stood farther away. Not because anyone physically moved me, because somehow the situation always evolved that way. Curious, I showed the album to Ethan. He sat beside me scrolling through dozens of images. First he said nothing. Then he stopped on a photograph from Easter. Noah sat in a high chair decorated with colorful eggs while Linda leaned toward him smiling. I was visible only at the edge of the frame. Ethan frowned. I never noticed this before. Neither had I. Not because the evidence was hidden, because we never looked at it all together. One image by itself meant nothing. 50 images told a story. A few days later, I received another unexpected message. This time it came from Melissa. Attached were screenshots from an old family group chat I barely remembered. The messages were nearly a year old. Linda had shared updates about Noah with various relatives. Again, none of the comments appeared dramatic. Yet when viewed together, they revealed something familiar. She repeatedly described milestones using language that placed her at the center of the experience. We are working on a sleep schedule. We are introducing new foods. We are figuring out what he likes. The word "we" appeared over and over. I stared at the messages. Ethan stared at them beside me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he shook his head. There is no reason she would say we. I quietly agreed. Thanksgiving arrived sooner than expected. Every year, the extended family gathered at a large farmhouse owned by one of Ethan's uncles. Nearly 30 relatives attended. Children ran through the yard. Football played on a television inside. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air. Normally, I enjoyed these gatherings. This year felt different. Not because I was nervous, because I sensed something was about to happen. From the moment we arrived, I noticed subtle changes. Relatives greeted me warmly. Several asked direct questions about Noah's routines, daycare schedule, and milestones. Questions that previously would have been directed toward Linda. It was a small shift, but I noticed it immediately. More importantly, Linda seemed to notice it too. Throughout the afternoon, she remained her usual self. Friendly, outgoing, confident. Yet there was a slight tension beneath the surface. Almost as though she sensed the atmosphere changing. Later that evening, while guests gathered around dessert tables, Ethan's father approached me. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Better," I admitted honestly. He nodded. Then he glanced around the room before lowering his voice slightly. "People have been talking." I knew exactly what he meant. "About Noah?" He nodded. "About a lot of things." Before I could respond, several relatives joined the conversation. Aunt Carol, Melissa, 2 cousins. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then someone casually mentioned the birthday party photographs. Another person brought up old family messages. A third relative described assumptions they once believed but no longer accepted. The discussion remained calm, respectful, honest. Yet with every new comment, a clearer picture emerged. People were finally comparing notes, finally examining where certain impressions originated. Across the room, I noticed Linda watching the conversation. Her expression remained composed, but her attention never left the group. Then Aunt Carol reached into her purse and removed several printed pages. "I almost forgot," she said. "I brought these because I thought Rachel might want them." My pulse immediately quickened. She handed the papers to me. At first glance, they appeared to be copies of old emails and family messages collected over several years. I slowly turned the first page, then the second, then the third. By the time I reached the final document, I realized Aunt Carol had unknowingly gathered the strongest evidence anyone had seen so far. And for the first time, the entire story existed in one place. I looked down at the stack of printed pages while the conversation around me slowly quieted. What Aunt Carol had collected was not dramatic evidence. There were no shocking confessions, no explosive statements. Yet somehow the pages felt more powerful because of that. They showed years of small comments placed side by side. Years of messages. Years of photographs. Years of carefully repeated language that created a story many people had unknowingly accepted. Melissa leaned forward and pointed to one of the pages. "This is the one that caught my attention." I scanned the highlighted section. It was an email Linda had sent shortly after Noah's first Christmas. In it, she described holiday traditions she planned to continue with my little boy for years to come. Standing alone, the phrase might have sounded affectionate. But next to dozens of similar messages, the pattern became impossible to miss. Ethan quietly took the papers and began reading them himself. His expression grew more serious with every page. Across the room, several relatives had now joined the conversation. Nobody appeared angry. Nobody was looking for conflict. They were simply reading, observing, connecting details. One cousin suddenly laughed in surprise. This explains something. Everyone looked toward her. A year ago, I honestly thought Linda watched Noah several days a week. Another relative immediately nodded. I thought the same thing. A third person added, I assumed she was involved in most parenting decisions. The comments continued, one after another. Different relatives, different assumptions. Yet nearly all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. They had been given an impression that did not match reality. The realization spread through the group naturally. No one needed to force it. The evidence spoke for itself. At some point, Ethan's father joined the discussion. He slowly reviewed the documents before setting them on the table. Then he asked a simple question. How much time does Linda actually spend helping with Noah? The room became quiet again. I answered honestly. She visits regularly. She loves him. But Ethan and I handle his daily care. We always have. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Apparently that information contradicted assumptions they had carried for a long time. One aunt shook her head. That is not the impression I had at all. Across the room, Linda remained seated with several relatives nearby. She was not participating in the discussion, but she was clearly aware of it. Every so often her eyes drifted toward our table. For the first time since Noah's birthday, I felt no desire to defend myself. No need to convince anyone of anything. The truth was finally moving through the family on its own. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan stood up. The room gradually grew quieter as more people noticed. He was not a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. When he spoke publicly, people listened. I want to clarify something, he said calmly. Every conversation stopped. Ethan glanced toward me before continuing. Rachel has been Noah's primary caregiver since the day he was born. The room remained silent. She planned his birthday party. She organized his milestones. She manages his routines. She has spent countless hours making sure he has everything he needs. His voice stayed steady, respectful, honest. Anyone who knows our family closely already understands that. He paused briefly. But recently I realized that not everyone received the same picture. No one interrupted. Ethan continued. That is not because Rachel failed as a mother. It is because a different story was repeated often enough that people started accepting it. Several relatives slowly nodded. One by one, faces around the room reflected understanding. Not hostility. Understanding. The distinction mattered. Then Ethan looked toward his mother. His expression remained calm. Mom, I know you love Noah. Linda nodded slightly. Ido. I know you care about him deeply. Another nod. But somewhere along the way, people started confusing your role with Rachel's role. The room became completely silent. For several seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally Linda took a slow breath. She looked around the table. Then she looked at me. For the first time all evening, the confidence that usually surrounded her seemed gone. What remained was something far more human. Reflection. I never realized how it sounded, she said quietly. The room stayed silent. Because everyone understood that. Those 6 words had just changed the entire conversation. And for the first time since Noah's first birthday, it felt like the truth was finally being heard by the person who needed it most. For several moments after Linda spoke, nobody said anything. The silence felt different from the uncomfortable silences that had defined so many family gatherings over the previous year. This one felt honest, reflective, necessary. I looked across the table at my mother-in-law and saw something I had not expected to see. Not defensiveness, not anger, not even embarrassment. What I saw was recognition, as though she was finally viewing the situation through someone else's eyes. Linda folded her hands together and looked down briefly before speaking again. I truly love Noah, she said quietly. I never wanted anyone to think otherwise. Ethan nodded. We know that. His response carried no hostility, only sincerity. Linda looked toward me. And I never wanted people to believe I was taking your place. Hearing those words affected me more than I expected. For months I had imagined confrontation. I had imagined arguments. I had imagined defending myself. Yet standing there, none of that seemed necessary anymore. The truth had already done the work. Everyone understood what had happened. More importantly, everyone understood what had not happened. This had never been about a grandmother loving her grandson too much. It had been about boundaries becoming blurred until people could no longer clearly see where one role ended and another began. Aunt Carol reached across the table and gently touched my arm. You have always been Noah's mother, she said. Several relatives immediately nodded. Others voiced agreement. The words were simple, but hearing them openly acknowledged felt surprisingly emotional. For so long, I had been trying to understand why the birthday party hurt so much. Now I finally understood. It was never about a single photograph. It was never about a single comment. It was about feeling invisible during moments that should have belonged to me. Moments I had earned through countless sleepless nights, early mornings, doctor appointments, bedtime routines, and ordinary acts of love that make up motherhood. The conversation continued for another hour. Calmly, respectfully. Family members shared observations. Linda listened. Sometimes she explained what she meant when certain comments were written. Sometimes she admitted that looking back, she could understand why people interpreted them differently. No one attacked her. No one tried to humiliate her. There was no dramatic ending. Just honesty. By the time dessert plates were cleared away and relatives began preparing to leave, something had shifted. The tension that had quietly existed beneath the surface for over a year seemed gone. Not because every problem had magically disappeared. Because everyone was finally operating from the same understanding of reality. As Ethan and I packed Noah's things later that evening, Linda approached me privately. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled softly. Thank you for being patient with me. I was surprised by the comment. I was not always patient. She laughed gently. You were more patient than most people would have been. We stood there for a second before she continued. You are a wonderful mother, Rachel. The words were not dramatic. Yet they were exactly what I needed to hear. Not because I required validation. Because they came from someone who finally seemed ready to acknowledge what should have been obvious all along. The drive home that night felt lighter than any drive home after a family gathering in recent memory. Noah slept peacefully in his car seat. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand. Neither of us needed to say much. The hardest part was over. Several months later, when Noah turned 18 months old, we hosted another family celebration. The atmosphere felt completely different. Relatives greeted me as the organizer. Questions came directly to me. Family photographs included everyone naturally. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt staged. Most importantly, I no longer felt invisible. Linda attended the celebration as well. She proudly embraced her role as grandmother. Nothing more. Nothing less. And somehow that role suited her better than any role she had been trying to occupy before. Looking back now, I do not think this story is about winning. I did not defeat anyone. Nobody lost. The real victory came when the truth finally had enough room to exist. Because roles within a family are not strengthened by competition. They are strengthened by respect. A grandmother's love is valuable. A mother's love is irreplaceable. And once everyone finally understood the difference, our family became healthier than it had ever been before. As for Noah, he will probably never remember any of this. He will not remember the birthday party. He will not remember the misunderstandings. He will not remember the conversations that followed. But one day, when he looks back at those photographs, he will see something that matters far more. He will see a family that eventually learned how to honor the people who loved him without confusing who they were. And that is the memory I wanted all along.